What's up guys, it's me Jeremy, and it's about damn time that I updated my support tier list for Season 4. Note that this tier list primarily applies just to solo queue, and although one of your champions may be low on this list, it's still solo queue after all, so you can still do okay with them by outplaying your opponents. Now, I decided to keep a lot less champions on the list this time, so if one of your champions isn't on the list at all, that doesn't mean that champion is not viable in the support role. Rather, what it means is that champion is not a meta pick for the support role. Anyways, let's get started with the bottom of tier 3. So, at the bottom of tier 3, the worst solo queue support champion that I have chosen is Soraka. Soraka has been a huge victim of some major stealth nerfs lately. What a stealth nerf is a nerf that occurs not because a champion gets directly nerfed, but because all of the other champions that perform the same role get buffed. And this is what happened to Soraka. Her lack of crowd control now makes her an extremely weak support champion, whereas earlier it wasn't as big of an issue. And most aggressive players can absolutely destroy Soraka's in lane, and she can only really succeed in passive lanes, but then once you get to the teamfight phase, she still kinda does nothing because of her lack of CC anyways. Soraka's utility is just absolutely terrible, and she does nothing with the extra Season 4 gold, so she's placed at the bottom of tier 3. Next comes Lissandra. Although Lissandra's support may be viable in competitive play, in solo queue, Lissandra suffers a lot from the lack of a solid laning phase. And although the AP she can get from her items helps, her base damages are fairly low and she's vastly outclassed by other crowd control supports, since she doesn't get very tanky. But all of her skills still have low ranges, so jumping in with your E becomes extremely risky to do. Her laning phase is just too damn weak, and she has an unsafe teamfight phase due to the awkward positioning of her low range skills, putting her low on this list. She can perform okay in some team comps though. Next, we have Alistar. Alistar has actually been a victim of a lot of direct nerfs in the past, and ever since those nerfs he's been having quite a bit of trouble. His mana costs are just way too high. He's also an extremely easy to outplay champion mechanically. It's very easy to dodge his combo with certain abilities or to avoid it altogether. On top of that, he's also a very difficult champion to play mechanically, and his base stats are actually extremely weak, so naturally Alistar is very squishy. And although he can do a little bit more with the Season 4 support gold, that doesn't change the fact that he's still kind of squishy, especially in lane, and his laning phase overall is pretty terrible due to that fact. And although his ultimate does help quite a bit with his tankiness, it's just not enough. Alistar actually currently sits at around a 45% win rate in solo queue, which is just absolutely terrible. Rounding up tier 3, we have Elise. Now, Elise support did actually get some buffs because of the items, but the thing is that Elise just doesn't seem to be that strong of a champion in the support role overall, due to the fact that she only has one crowd control ability, that's single target, and it's a skill shot. And since her cocoon is the only crowd control ability she has, she suffers quite a bit in the support role, and even though she can get a little bit tankier now and do a little bit more damage, that's not really what you need the support to do. You need the support to be a CC machine and be able to kite enemy opponents, and Elise just can't really do that. She is very good at chasing, but that's not what you need supports to do. Alright, moving into tier 2. At the bottom of tier 2 we have Janna. In the Season 4 patch, Janna's passive was significantly nerfed to the point where now she isn't that good of a champion. And Riot has stated that they will buff Janna in the future, so expect her to move up in this list in a few weeks or so once the buff comes out. And although Janna's utility is still pretty solid, her laning phase is just way too weak now because of all her nerfs in the past. And then now, her overall utility for everyone on the map is pretty much nothing because of the passive nerf, so that also hurts her a lot too. Janna has just become really weak, and she's also a victim of a stealth nerf too, just like a lot of the other champions that are low on these lists, because she didn't really get a buff in Season 4, whereas all the other champions kinda did. Next on tier 2 we have Lulu. Now Lulu can actually be a very viable pick in the right situations. She combos really well with certain champions and also does very well against other champions. But the thing is that if you pick Lulu in a composition where you do not have a champion to synergize your ult with, for example someone like Vi or Nocturne, where they can jump in and you can use your ultimate on them for some massive CC, if you don't have someone like that on your team, Lulu is actually an extremely terrible pick. And that's why she's so low on this list. Add into that she doesn't really scale very well with gold, and the new Season 4 changes haven't really buffed her at all, and her utility can be somewhat lacking if you don't pick her in the right composition, and as such, her win rate in solo queue has actually dropped to 46%, which is really, really low and unfortunate. Maybe we'll see some Lulu buffs in the future, but right now I would only recommend picking Lulu in solo queue when you can synergize her ult really well with some of your teammates. Next on tier 2 we have Nunu. Nunu actually hasn't been seeing that much play in solo queue as a support champion very much in the past couple of months. And that's not exactly for a bad reason. I mean, Nunu doesn't really do that much. When Nunu's attack speed buff was nerfed pretty significantly, he actually took an extremely big hit. And now in Season 4, Nunu has kind of received a stealth nerf as well, so his laning has become much, much weaker overall. And his buff isn't enough to carry team fights anymore like it used to be. And as such, Nunu's placed towards the bottom of tier 2. Next on tier 2, we have Fiddlesticks. Fiddlesticks was here pretty much all of last season, and he's going to be here probably pretty much all of this season, unless they nerf his CC. His CC is pretty solid once he gets to the late game. His early laning phase is very, very weak because his CC scales with levels, of course. And overall, Fiddlesticks is a very weird support champion. He doesn't really need to scale with items, and he focuses a lot on the late game, and his laning phase is really awkward because it's hard to poke, but then you can also set up plays with your ultimate too. So he is still in the top half of tier 2 because his CC overall is pretty solid, and his level 6 is extremely strong, but his early laning phase being really weak, and add to the fact that his Drain is pretty much an absolutely useless ability on him when he's played as support, and it leaves him with pretty much just being an average champion overall. Next on tier 2 we have Lux support. Lux's binding is actually an extremely powerful ability as a support role, and she can benefit quite a bit from getting some AP in her build with the new Season 4 changes, so overall Lux has become a little bit stronger, but her laning phase is still fairly average and her teamfight phase is still fairly average. And that pretty much just leaves her in the upper half tier 2 spot. Now at the top of tier 2 we have Nami. Nami is a pretty solid support champion. She definitely could be considered tier 1 in some certain compositions, but she does suffer a lot from the fact that she's so squishy. Not to mention that she is pretty much the victim of a stealth nerf as well, and she's also pretty difficult to play with in solo queue. Moving on to tier 1. At the bottom of tier 1 we have Annie. Annie is a very solid support champion now. Her damage is really good. You can build AP on her now and do quite a decent bit of damage and be a threat in teamfights, but her stun is kind of unreliable for kiting opponents in teamfights, and it can be very good for initiations. It's just not necessarily that powerful, and she is still a very good champion, and her laning phase is pretty solid, but she does kind of lose to some of the tankier supports in lane since she doesn't have sustain and she's also very squishy. So she does have some poor matchups, but her teamfight phase overall is very good and her damage is pretty solid. So we put her at the bottom of tier 1. Next on tier 1 we actually have Blitzcrank. Now Blitzcrank is a very interesting support champion and can be a very big wild card in some games, but the fact is that Blitzcrank simply just doesn't fit any team comps. And that's why you don't see Blitzcrank in competitive play, but he really does just not fit any team comps. There's no team comps that Blitzcrank fits. He doesn't really synergize well with any teams, and he has so many counter picks, and although his hook is of course a ridiculously game-changing ability sometimes if used properly, and that leaves him at tier 1, he does suffer a little bit, and so that puts him at the bottom of tier 1. Next on tier 1 we have Zyra. Now Zyra used to be one of the best support champions, but she did suffer a little bit from the stealth nerfs. I think overall the buffs in Season 4 were mainly to the tanky support champions, and Zyra can build AP, but the thing is that you really don't need supports to be the ones doing damage. So building AP on the support isn't necessarily as important as you might expect it to be. And Zyra's CC is of course still ridiculously strong and very good for disengage, and she does fit quite a bit of team comps, but she does have some weaker laning phase matchups now, especially because some of her good matchups got buffed, so that does hurt her overall laning. And that leaves Zyra around the middle of tier 1. Next on tier 1 we have Sona. Sona will always be a very strong champion in the support role until they nerf her base damages. Her poke is really good, allowing her to have a solid laning phase. She has good sustain, so you can play passively or you can play aggressively if you want to, and her ultimate is just ridiculously strong, and she has a slow on top of her kit as well as the damage reduction and the bonus damage from all of her power chords. Her power chord is a very powerful ability, and her ultimate is just absolutely game changing and can be fight winning, and that makes Sona a very strong champion. Now Sona does have some bad matchups, especially against the tanky support champions, but overall her laning phase is pretty solid, and her teamfight phase is definitely top of the line for supports because of her ultimate, so that makes her a very good support champion. Taking home the bronze medal, we have Leona. Due to the Season 4 changes, Leona actually got a huge buff and is starting to feel extremely powerful in this patch. She just benefits so much from being able to build full tank items like Randuin's and Sunfire Cape, as opposed to building Locket like you used to in the previous patch. And because of this, Leona is now much more powerful in Season 4, since you can jump in and you'll live for a lot longer and your team will be able to follow you up much better. And she still does have a ton of CC on her Q, E, and ultimate that can hit a lot of people, and she's strong throughout pretty much all points of the game except for maybe at level 1, and that's only at level 1. Her level 2 is still ridiculously powerful, and her laning phase is good too. Pretty much all of her laning matchups now are actually really solid. All of her bad matchups are pretty significant victims of stealth nerfs, like Lulu and Nunu that used to be really good against Leona. They're kind of falling out because they weren't buffed from the patch, whereas Leona did improve quite a bit. And overall, Leona has now become a very powerful support champion. Taking home the silver medal, we have Thresh. Thresh will always be a ridiculously strong support champion due to the massive amount of utility his kit creates. And he also benefits quite a bit from being able to build these main tank items now. And as Thresh can hook and have all this crowd control ability, his kiting potential is just absurd. But one thing Thresh does suffer a little bit from is that he can be hard to play with, especially in the lower tier levels of play. And so that does hurt his solo queue viability just a little bit, but he's still definitely a very powerful champion, and pretty much all of his laning phase matchups are very solid. And at the top of the tier 1 list, we have Taric with the gold medal. Taric currently sits at a 55% win rate in solo queue, which is absolutely ridiculous, and has gained a huge benefit for the Season 4 support changes. He now gains quite a bit of gold and can get ridiculously tanky with the items now. And on top of that, Taric is extremely easy to play with, and that makes him very good in solo queue because he's really easy to play with. His stun is not a skill shot, he has sustain, he gives tankiness to your team, all things that make him very easy for AD carries that you've never played with to play with, and that makes Taric the #1 support champion because he's just so damn easy to play with and to play as well. He's a very mechanically easy champion to play, and his kit overall is still really strong, and it's enough to kite opponents away from your AD carry while also still being a very tanky force. So that is it for my Season 4 support tier list so far. Remember that these rankings are of course subject to change depending on buffs and nerfs and flavor of the months and all those kind of things, but that's how I see these things to be right now. My name is Jeremy, and that is it for my video on the solo queue support tier list. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to check out some of my others on the screen right now. Please follow my stream at twitch.tv/Jeremy_GamingCurios for updates on whenever I'm streaming, and I'd love it if you could support me with a like or subscribe for more awesome content in the future if you enjoyed this video. And of course, I'd love it if you could follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/GamingCurios. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.